As I mentioned before, the ship doesn't get its movement inputs itself. Um, the input control object gets the inputs and passes them to the ship. Um, so the input control uses a strategy method. So input control is an instance of movement controller, which is a base class, um, which derives two methods for getting input. One being human input from a human player and input from an AI. Um, so what these effectively do is they take the virtual methods of the movement controller, they override them, and then whenever whenever a call is made to the input control, it grabs the corresponding method for getting that input. So, for example, input control get fire. If my input control is an instance of is player movement, I'll grab input. It'll grab its fire method, and all that does is um, check to see if I press space, and if so, then fire. On the other hand, if I'm using an AI to get my movement, um, it'll just fire. So yeah. Needs to update its positional. Okay. All right. So the ship, for the most part, just keeps track of itself, its movement, firing, what it can collide with. Um, the way I have it set up, there is only ever one ship, and each player just uses the same ship. Uh, in order to handle data that pertains to each individual players, I created the player object. The player object is responsible for storing its mushroom grid, uh, storing its mushroom grid, its score, the number of lives, and the index of its current wave, as well as its input control. Um, all this data is accessed and distributed through the player manager. Um, let me open up the player manager. So the player manager is a singleton. Um, it just keeps track of the current player. It'll update the variables. It'll update the variables in the current player. It if another class needs to know something about the current player, um, it'll make a call to the player manager um, using one of these various static functions. Um, the player manager will then do whatever the other class needs. Um, because the player manager handles the life count of the current player, I also made it in charge of calling game over and between attractor mode, switching between attractor mode. Um, Also, because it handles game overs, um, I felt like I kind of had to make it a game object because um, primarily just to utilize alarms. So let me show you an example of that. So here, okay. So when the player gets game over, it does all the necessary stuff. It prints the text, prints the list of high scores, and then it has to wait 3 seconds before it switches it switches scenes. So yeah, that's really the only reason why I made a game object. Yeah. Um. So yeah, just going over how it's a singleton. It has a static instance of itself. Um. Like I said, it has a various amount of service methods which are used by other classes to communicate with the manager. Um. Oh, it's termination. Just showcase that really quick. So when it terminates, it destroys its instance of itself and sets it back to null pointer. When it's deleted, it'll destroy the one instance of ship that it has that all the players use. And it'll also clean up the list of players that it creates. And yeah, that's all of the player stuff.